Hi, my name is Diane, and this is My Pink Bathtub. I have been knitting for over 15 years, and I am here to help you learn a little bit about knitting. Today, we are going to go over a couple of things before we get started in actual casting on. And those things are going to include needles, what different types of materials needles are made out of, and what different types of needles there are, what kind of recommended yarn and needle size you should be knitting with when you're beginning. And we're going to take a look at Garter Stitch and Stockinette Stitch. Here are the three different materials that knitting needles are made of. Metal needles. These are types you usually find if in your grandma's stash of needles. They are inflexible and they are very slippery, so I would not recommend learning how to knit on a metal needle. Plastic needles. There's a bit more give to them. If this is all you have, it is a good option to learn how to knit. And my recommendation would be a wooden needle, also known as a bamboo needle. Now, Walmart does sell these. So they are much softer on the hands to work with. As well, they will grip the stitches better than a metal or a plastic needle. The metal needles, the stitches will definitely be slippery, and when you're learning how to knit, could be difficult to keep them on the needle. The plastic ones are okay if that's your only option, but if possible, without you having to run out and buy a whole bunch of things, I would highly recommend a wooden needle to start. Besides the kind of material that needles are made out of, there are also different types of knitting needles, which may be confusing if you're new to this craft. Here is the standard type of straight needle. Now, this would have a wooden ball or some sort of an end on it, and this is what you would use for basic straight knitting. We also have something called a circular needle. Now, this is what you can knit straight on it if you're knitting something very long like a shawl. It is a good option, and you could just turn it like you would the needles, but it's also used to knit in the round to make something such as a hat. And when you knit in the round, you do not have to sew up your seams, which is something I really like because, first of all, I don't enjoy sewing up seams, and secondly, the finish will be much nicer. Now, this is considered a 16-inch circular needle, but you can get them in all types of lengths, like 32-inch and up. So when I mentioned you can knit something like a shawl or a blanket or something really long on it, you're just going to get yourself a needle that has a very long size to it. So this is basically a great one for hats. And the third option when you're looking at needles are these. These are called double pointed needles. And they can be used for straight knitting when you're knitting smaller things. And I will be doing my tutorials with this because I tried doing them on these needles and I kept hitting the table, and that's just going to be too annoying. So these are used in a fashion similar to this. So you would cast on, you would transfer the needles, so many on each needle, or transfer the stitches, sorry, so many on each needle, and then you would join in the round, just like you would join in the round here. The great thing about double pointed needles is if you choose to knit toys or something that doesn't have a lot of stitches, you can put as many stitches as you want on these. Whereas something like this, if you start having to decrease your stitches, like say for example you're making a hat, You will eventually, when you make the crown of the hat, start decreasing your stitches using certain types of stitches. And it may be more challenging to knit if you're getting to this point. So quite often on patterns, it's going to tell you that you're going to need a circular needle and double pointed needles, because the double pointed needles will eventually have your stitches transferred onto them when you do your decreases and you close up, say, your hat, for example. So those are the three types of materials that needles are made of, and the three standard types of needles that you're going to see when you're shopping for needles in the store. I also just want to go briefly into explanation on the difference between knitting and crocheting. Again, I am not a crocheter, but I've been around the block a little bit to see how crocheting works, and it is something on my bucket list to learn. Now, obviously, the first difference is crocheting has a single hook, and knitting you have two needles that you work with. So when you crochet, you're always just working with one live stitch at a time. And when I see my crochet friends crocheting, I notice that they can just pick up on their project, on the pattern that they're working on anytime, because you're just working on one live stitch as you work your creation. But with knitting, you have multiple live stitches on one needle, and your other needle, you are transferring your stitches from your left hand needle, which is your live needles, and this is your working needle, your right hand needle, that you're going to be transferring your stitches on. So it is a huge no-no to not complete an entire row when you are knitting. It's very important. When I was a new knitter, I sometimes would stop in the middle of the row and put my knitting away, and I would pick it up, and unfortunately I wouldn't know which side I was knitting on because I wasn't familiar with what the stitches look like, and I would start knitting in the wrong direction. So you're going to learn the phrase, "Let me just finish my row." If, say, for example, Hubs wants you to come and help him do something, "Let me just finish my row." Let's chant that together. So never, ever, ever stop in the middle of working on a row. So as you are learning to knit, I would encourage you to use a larger size needle. It's a little easier, and it's going to be easier to see the stitches and to help you identify the stitches. And if you're going to use a bit of a larger size needle, like for example, this is a 6.5 millimeter, I wouldn't use anything than a 5 millimeter needle when you're learning. You're going to end up using a bulky weight yarn. Or you can do something really big like an 8 millimeter needle and like a super bulky weight, like a 6 weight yarn. You're not going to want to use something really thin to start, like a sock yarn. So that's my suggestion for your recommended yarn. One other thing I'd like to show you before we go to the next video and learn how to cast on is what your stitches are going to look like depending on what you put on your stitches, whether you're doing knitting and purling or straight knitting. So we're going to start learning to cast on, then we're going to learn the knit stitch, and you're going to need to practice. And once you learn the knit stitch, if you knit both sides of the needle, so you knit a complete row and then you turn it over and knit the other row, you are going to get something called garter stitch. And this is what garter stitch looks like. They're just rows of bumps with V's in between. Both sides look exactly the same. This is really a great option when you're doing some basic knitting and you want to, say, make a scarf, for example, because as you can see, it is laying pretty flat. The fabric is not curling up. and it is laying quite flat. And then you could probably take a crochet hook if you wanted to just make a scarf and then crochet some tassels in on the bottom for your first project, a basic scarf. Now, if you want to do knitting on one row and then purling on the second row, you're going to get something that looks like this. I'm going to show you another example with the back of my business card because it might be easier to see. But you're going to create a whole bunch of V's. And that is called Stockinette Stitch. So here is the knitted size where we have all our V's, and on the opposite side are all these bumps, and those are the purl side. Now you'll notice, compared to the garter stitch, which is knitting on both sides, this is curling up. So it's not the best option if you just want to do a stockinette scarf because it's not going to lay flat. Often you can do other things like ribbing and some sort of a border to make it start flat and then it'll stay flat. But if you're just doing knitting on one side and purling on the other, you're going to get it to curl up. As you learn to knit, you're going to recognize these stitches more, and it's going to be far more familiar to you, but I just wanted to give you a basic guideline of what they look like before we get started. So I'm excited. Grab yourself some needles, grab yourself some yarn, maybe make yourself a cup of coffee or something stronger if you need it, and let's get started learning how to knit. I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.